100% tariffs. That's the threat sitting on the table right now between Washington and Ottawa, and on paper, it sounds like a move that should work. Canada sends roughly a quarter of its entire GDP across the American border. Cut off that access, and the economic pressure should be unbearable. That's the logic. But here's what nobody in Washington seems to have accounted for. Canada already built the exit before the threat was even made. What's unfolding right now isn't just a trade dispute. It's a case study in how economic coercion stops working once the target stops depending on you. Trump's tariff strategy follows a pattern that's worked before. You identify a country's economic lifeline, threaten to cut it, and wait for compliance. For Canada, that lifeline has always been American market access. The math is straightforward. Restrict exports, create domestic pain, force policy adjustments before the targeted government can adapt. It's a pressure campaign built on speed. The problem is that this approach requires the target to have nowhere else to go and no time to build alternatives. Canada, quietly and deliberately, has spent the last 2 years doing exactly that. Mark Carney's $63 billion defense commitment isn't a symbolic number meant to satisfy NATO benchmarks. It's a structural overhaul of Canada's industrial base, and the majority of that capital isn't flowing south to American contractors. It's embedded inside Canada, concentrated specifically in Ontario and Quebec, where aerospace manufacturing has been scaled up at a pace that surprised even industry analysts. Approximately 12,600 direct aerospace jobs have been created, with the total economic footprint estimated at around 30,000 when supply chains and local services are factored in. These aren't temporary positions. These are skilled manufacturing roles tied to long-term production contracts. And that distinction matters enormously when you're trying to calculate whether a tariff threat can force a government to fold. The infrastructure being built tells the real story. Around 120 next-generation fighters are slated for production inside Canada, alongside roughly 40 F-35 aircraft with significant Canadian industrial participation. Rolls-Royce engines are being assembled in Montreal. Key components are manufactured across Ontario and Quebec facilities operating under technology transfer agreements that ensure Canada retains full domestic capability. None of this is projected or theoretical. The factories have been expanded. Production lines are installed. Contracts are signed. This is operational capacity, and tariffs cannot reach it. They can tax goods crossing the border into the United States. They cannot dismantle a factory in Montreal producing aircraft that were never headed to the American market in the first place, which brings us to the part of this story that reframes everything. Canada isn't building these aircraft for itself alone. Ukraine is contracted for 150 jets tied to Canadian production. Portugal is projected to acquire between 30 and 40. Peru is positioned for roughly 25. The Philippines is seeking between 15 and 20. Poland and several other allied nations have entered procurement arrangements tied to Canadian manufacturing. These are active contracts with allied militaries across Europe, Latin America, and the Indo-Pacific. Tariffs between Canada and the United States don't block a single one of those shipments. The revenue streams have already been diversified beyond North America, and that happened at precisely the moment the American market was threatening to become a weapon against Ottawa. Here's where it gets politically awkward for Washington. Trump has spent years publicly pressuring NATO allies to hit the 2% of GDP defense spending threshold, calling out countries that failed to meet it as free riders. Canada's $63 billion expansion pushes it toward and beyond that target. On paper, Canada just did what the U.S. demanded. The problem, from the Pentagon's perspective, is that the bulk of that spending isn't landing in Fort Worth or other American production centers tied to the F-35 program. It's anchored inside Canada. So now Washington faces a dilemma it created. Objecting to Canadian defense expansion contradicts the long-standing demand for higher spending, but accepting spending that flows into sovereign Canadian capacity rather than American procurement pipelines isn't what the pressure campaign was designed to produce. Trying to argue both positions publicly is nearly impossible without exposing that the real objective was never about defense readiness. It was about where the money goes. Meanwhile, the tariff push is fracturing inside Washington itself. The U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution aimed at blocking Trump's tariffs on Canadian goods, closing at 2119 to 2111. 6 Republicans broke ranks and joined Democrats. John Bacon of Nebraska, Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, Jeff Hurd of Colorado, Kevin Kiley of California, Thomas Massey of Kentucky, and Dan Newhouse of Washington. Their concerns weren't ideological, they were local. Newhouse pointed out that Washington state's economy is deeply tied to cross-border trade with Canada, and that businesses and workers there are taking real damage. Bacon described the tariffs plainly as a net negative, a significant tax absorbed by American consumers, manufacturers, and farmers. The Congressional Budget Office backed that up, up, with projections showing U.S. businesses absorb roughly 30% of tariff-related costs or squeeze margins, while passing the remaining 70% directly to consumers as higher prices. Trump responded to the vote by taking to social media, warning Republicans that opposing tariffs would come with consequences during election season, including primary challenges. The resolution still faces a likely veto even if the Senate approves it, but the symbolic damage of losing House Republicans on a signature policy is real. When members of your own party start publicly questioning the legal and economic foundation of a trade war, the political calculus around escalation gets messier. The deeper irony of all of this is that the tariff threat may have produced exactly the outcome it was trying to prevent. Before tensions escalated, Canada defaulted heavily to American equipment and maintained deep procurement integration with U.S. defense contractors. When policymakers began perceiving genuine vulnerability, they redirected capital into sovereign capacity instead. The $63 billion program can be read as a structural hedge against uncertainty in Washington. And once that hedge reaches operational scale, once factories are running, export contracts are active, and allied customers are waiting on delivery schedules, the leverage that inspired the hedge weakens considerably. You can't undo institutional knowledge. You can't revoke technology transfer agreements with a tariff. You can't breach international export contracts with a social media post. What's happening between Ottawa and Washington right now is bigger than a bilateral trade spat. It's a test of whether economic coercion still functions against technologically advanced allies or decide to build alternatives instead of conceding. Canada's answer, embedded in running production lines and signed contracts across 4 continents, is that it doesn't. Not once. The structural transformation is already in motion. The factories in Ontario and Quebec, the engines assembling in Montreal, the jets headed to Ukraine and Portugal and the Philippines, and the tens of thousands of workers whose livelihoods are now tied to aerospace production collectively represent something that no tariff percentage can reverse. The calculus has shifted, and that shift, not the tariff number, not the House vote, not the social media warnings, is the story that will be studied long after this particular dispute is resolved.